American citizens continue to be held as hostages in an attempt to force unacceptable demands on our country.
Hello and welcome to Carter's Crisis, the podcast where we discuss the issues that influenced the Iranian Hostage Crisis and assess the different ways in which these impacted President Carter and his administration. In today's episode, we will focus on the American reaction to the crisis. Through identifying key events of the 444 days, we will analyse the changes in President Carter's popularity throughout the crisis, the challenges facing him, and conclude on the impact this had on his chances of re-election and legacy as president. I would like to welcome Emily, Georgia, and Tom to Carter's Crisis. Thank you very much for coming on.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi.
President Carter was a relatively unknown political force before his election, serving only as governor of his native Georgia. At the start of the Democrat presidential primaries, he was seen as an outsider and only a regional candidate. Yet he managed to defeat much more prominent politicians due to his effective national strategy and appeal to religious and conservative voters. Tom, how did the US press view the Carter administration before the hostage crisis?
So as you've mentioned, Adam, Jimmy Carter did not have the same political prestige as other presidents. For example, he was famous for being a peanut farmer prior to being the leader of the country, and some argue that he came into power as a friendly face amidst a sea of politicians who had lost the nation's trust throughout the 1970s. A New York Times article from January 1977 indicates that the American people were still unsure of what sort of president he would be. His economic plan was viewed as liberal in impulse and conservative in size. Essentially, Carter seems like a safe bet for president, as he was cautious and it appeared that he would avoid the same sort of reckless action which had damaged the reputations of his predecessors.
Georgia, how did this compare to public opinion in this period?
Well, prior to the hostage crisis, the United States under Carter was already dealing with stagflation and oil shortages. American society was motor-dominated by the 1970s, with the American dream partially revolving around the ability to own and drive a car. As a result, the American people weren't very happy when their daily lives were disrupted because they couldn't fill up their cars. Of course, oil and fuel weren't just needed for cars but also to run industry in the home. So as a consequence of the oil shortage combined with economic depression, the American people were looking for help from their government and for active solutions, something that the Carter administration wasn't giving.
Thank you for that, Georgia. It is clear that economic issues were an important theme of this period. What were some of the major events which would shape the Carter presidency?
Prior to the 1970s, America had a clear and strong image as one of two global superpowers, and many Americans even felt that it was the dominant one of the two, particularly after the symbolic landing of the first man on the moon. However, the embarrassing failure in Vietnam after years of campaigning against the conflict, combined with the shocking revelation of espionage amidst the Watergate scandal, meant that there was a severe lack of faith in the US government when Jimmy Carter came to power. It appeared that the government served itself rather than the American people, and whilst Carter may have had the support of America for now, he was certainly in a precarious position.
Georgia, how do you feel about this?
Well, following Watergate in Vietnam, as Tom pointed out, the American people struggled with comprehending the economic and political repercussions. The withdrawal from Vietnam produced an Oval Office which was nearly impossible to rectify. So when political distrust was combined with the economic turmoil of exiting a war, which had been fought for decades prior, the American public were never going to like their government. For government action could not solve the macroeconomic issues, especially when the stagflation that resulted undermined government intervention.
A nuclear arms race with the Soviet Union had been ongoing since the end of the Second World War. Since the Soviet Union's first successful nuclear tests in 1949, both nations had been pushing for bigger, better, and more effective nuclear weaponry. The Strategic Arms Limitation talks began in 1969, with the SALT I Treaty concluded in 1972. These talks aimed to limit the number and development of nuclear weaponry, in view of decreasing tensions and investment in these kind of programs. The SALT II Treaty aimed to expand upon the agreements of the first, and were a major focus of Carter's administration when they came into power. Carter and Soviet General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev signed the treaty in Vienna in 1979. A similarly important negotiation for Carter was the Camp David Accords. Carter and Cyrus Vance, his Secretary of State, aimed for peace in the Middle East at the beginning of their term. The Accords negotiated for peace and political relations between Israel and Egypt, as previously mentioned, and were signed in September 1978. As again mentioned in the last podcast, this was the major focus for Carter in the region until the hostage crisis. The hostage-taking on the 4th of November 1979 changed everything. Issues which many Americans had viewed as irrelevant to them, taking place a world away, were abruptly placed on their doorstep. President Carter reflects that, as had been the case since I first became president, there seemed to be no way I could stay out of Middle East affairs. Georgia, how did the hostage-taking change people's views on President Carter?
Well, immediately following the crisis, Carter's popularity actually followed the pattern of the rally round the flag phenomenon, seen at several points in history, whereby the public response to a president during a time of international crisis is favourable, regardless of the wisdom of the policy he pursues. Within a month of the crisis, Carter's popularity actually rocketed from 32 to 58% approval, supporting this theory.
Tom, what was the press reaction?
Well, the US press certainly supported and even created the atmosphere which Georgia has discussed, as it strongly emphasised the human factor. The issue was initially announced through phrases such as 60 Americans taken captive, which inspired unity and meant that many people were emotionally invested in the crisis, as fellow innocent Americans were in danger. Where the calculated risk of taking the Shah into America is depicted as having failed due to the lack of logic and reason from the Iranian camp, it is clear that initial perspectives on the crisis reflected an us versus them mentality. The president and the government were supported in the spirit of persevering through the adversity of a takeover, which everyone expected to be resolved swiftly.
Emily, how did the international community react to the crisis?
Well, the hostage crisis was also a big event on the global stage. It is important to remember that international opinion is not a singular thing. Responses and reactions will always differ dramatically, depending on the political views and aims of the country. From looking through broadcasts and newspaper publications of specific countries, we can see the main themes of concern and initial reactions to a number of the events during the crisis. Carter's memoirs show us that some countries, such as France, were willing but not overly enthusiastic to be backing America. However, as many leaders mention in their statements reacting to the hostage-taking, an act such as this was in violation of international law. So even if countries disapproved of how America had handled the revolution in Iran, not many leaders would want to be seen endorsing this move by the Iranian students, as it would open up hostage-taking as a viable reaction to future political upset.
Carter moved immediately to identify himself with the hostages, and made it clear he was personally overseeing efforts for their safe return. He emphasised that the hostages were his main focus, as he cancelled previously planned state visits and engagements such as those campaigning for his re-election. This meant, in David Farber's words, that the fate of the hostages became, vox populi, a vital part of how Americans looked at the fate of the nation. And, as Jordan, his campaign manager and chief of staff, understood from the beginning, many Americans charged Carter with making the story come out right. Therefore, any failure to bring the hostages home in a timely manner would result in a dramatic fall in Carter's popularity. By the beginning of 1980, it had become apparent to many that there would be no quick fix to the problems of the crisis. Tom, How did this impact opinion of Carter's handling of the crisis in the new year?
Whilst the human factor had initially inspired unity, the continuation of regular interviews with family members and friends meant that Carter's administration was under constant scrutiny as the issue remained at the centre of public attention, and this gradually shifted towards resentment. A key reason for this was his preference for negotiation, a slow process, over military action. Carter has later admitted that he could have wiped Iran off of the map, and his wife has also said that one difficulty was that peace was not popular in their country whilst war was. And the media's black and white portrayal of Iran did not help the matter, as the regular videos of flag burning, chants of death to America, and the demonisation of Khomeini in US media made the situation appear less complex, as Iran appeared as inherently hostile to America, so the average American viewer couldn't understand or couldn't comprehend a military force was not being used instead of the slow negotiation process which has proven to fail for months on end.
However, it would be inaccurate to state that the hostage crisis was the sole influence of people's opinions on Jimmy Carter in this period. Georgia, how did other global events of the time have a similar impact?
Well, Carter's popularity actually increased to between 50 and 60% over the transition months of the new year. Part of this will be due to his stand against the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in December 1979. In halting the SALT II treaty talks with the Soviet Union, Carter was demonstrating the anti-communist stance that the American public wanted to see. With the disastrous handling of Vietnam held in recent memory, much of the voting public were grateful to see a firm tackling of communism. So when it came to the American public, although the hostage crisis wasn't being handled well, there was widespread appreciation and fluctuation in opinion due to Carter's tackling of the Soviets instead.
America could not implement its strategies alone. Emily, how did other nations respond to the American call to arms?
The longer a situation drags on, often the more damaging it can be to a president's reputation. However, international concerns still seem to be particularly focused on the fear of military intervention. Carter had exhausted many of his other options with little success. He had requested that his allies join with him to boycott Iran. However, the attempts did not seem to make a huge difference, as there were countries, such as Austria and Yugoslavia, that had stated they were still willing to supply Iran with commodities. We have to remember the Cold War context of the period. There had been moments where direct conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union seemed to be a very real possibility, and the unsolved hostage crisis was causing panic that this was another chance for the countries to come to heads. It is important to note, however, that just because Iran were anti-American, it doesn't mean they were supporters of communism. In fact, they were also planning to boycott the 1980 Moscow Olympics due to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. The publications coming from Iran, claiming they were putting imperialism on trial, combined with the inability of Carter to make any progress towards a solution, was embarrassing to his reputation. However, still, many countries were reiterating the need to avoid military conflict due to fear of being dragged into a war.
Thank you, Emily. By March, calls from within Carter's administration to do more were becoming stronger, particularly from within the National Security Council and its head, Dr. Brzezinski, as mentioned previously. While Secretary of State Cyrus Vance was away for the weekend, Brzezinski called a meeting of the Security Council in which President Carter authorized Operation Eagle Claw, the military rescue mission. Upon his return, Vance offered his resignation, furious that such a major decision had been taken without his input. Carter accepted. As a member of the Security Council, Gary Sick asserts, Vance had dominated decision-making in the first 2 months of the crisis, but the balance of power was shifting towards the more proactive Brzezinski. Carter had lost faith and patience in the prolonged negotiations promoted by Vance. The operation took place on the 24th of April 1980 and was a disaster. 3 of the helicopters carrying the assault force suffered issues in flight, and the mission was aborted. During the withdrawal, one of the RH-53D Sea Stallion helicopters collided with a C-130 Hercules transport aircraft, killing all 8 US servicemen on board. President Carter made a television address on the 25th, explaining the rescue operation to the public and taking responsibility for its failure. Ayatollah Khomeini claimed that divine intervention had led to the failure of the operation, and this led to a further growth of his prestige in Iran. Furthermore, President Bani Sadr and his political allies who were calling for the release of the hostages were weakened, damaging the prospects of a resolution of the crisis in a timely manner. Emily, what do you think was the impact of the failure of Operation Eagle Claw on President Carter?
Well, even if Carter's reputation had been affected by the hostage crisis, we have to remember that the United States is an extremely powerful country still, and for some places, maintaining or creating a close friendship with America is most important. An interesting summation of different international reactions to the events can be found in the Guardian newspaper, titled World Reaction Mostly Critical. The title itself reflects the initial thoughts of many countries. However, it's interesting to consider that a previous story published by the paper involves Prime Minister Thatcher expressing her admiration for Carter's courage over the operation. A reaction on the opposite end of the spectrum to this can be found in the French newspaper Le Monde. As mentioned, France's leaders did not seem thrilled by Americans' actions in Iran so far, and military failure seemed to be the final straw. Although media representation only gives us a limited insight, the statement published in the French newspaper is suggested to reflect the government's views on the events. It questioned, how do we judge a military setup on which most of this planet's security depends, which is not capable of putting down 2 aeroplanes in a desert when the enemy has not yet put in an appearance? This seems to be one of the strongest reactions to events, with many other countries simply expressing their concern and calling for more caution in future moves to ensure peace.
In response to this failure, the US military launched a comprehensive review into the operation. It concluded that the use of non-specialist US naval aviators who were not trained in low-level flying or aerial refueling was one of the major flaws in the plan. This prompted the formation of the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, who specialise in supporting special operations soldiers and train intensively in the aforementioned disciplines. A lack of inter-service cooperation was also blamed, contributing to the formation of the United States Special Operations Command in 1987, which founded a special operations arm for each of the 4 services, and therefore promoted cooperation between them. Tom and Georgia, how do you feel about this?
Where President Carter openly addressed the US people and informed them of the tragedy which had occurred, he took full responsibility, which meant that the failure was instantly tied to the White House. Indeed, news reports contained phrases such as 8 Americans were killed when the White House launched a rescue operation but only reached a remote desert site over 200 miles southeast of Tehran. From here it is clear that the issues were pinned on the White House explicitly, and some even made comparisons to the unjustified optimism prior to the Bay of Pigs. NATO had not been informed, which led to outrage amongst the likes of NATO Secretary-General Lunt, who predicted a strong reaction from the Iranians, as he said that the US action had complicated the situation. Equally, interviews with senators revealed that Carter had not consulted Congress and hence had breached the War Powers Act. This highlighted a rift between Carter and his close advisors and the rest of government, meant that Carter's judgment was specifically questioned, as it was clear that he'd not only gone behind the backs of his international supporters, but had also gone behind the backs of his own government.
Well, what the American public saw was a failed mission that resulted in the death of 8 US servicemen. There was no opportunity to put a positive spin on that story or to defend President Carter in any way. Americans had been killed overseas, and that was the focus in the mindset of the American public. The impact was the further degradation of Carter's popularity, most importantly because, as Tom mentioned, he took the responsibility on himself, which was admirable but possibly ill-advised.
Jimmy Carter announced his candidacy for a second term as president in November 1979. How did the developments of the hostage crisis impact his campaign and chances of re-election?
Well, by November 1980, nearly anyone could have beaten Jimmy Carter. Carter looked weak regarding foreign policy, incompetent regarding economics, and stagnant when it came to any social mobility. In the mindset of the American public as they cast their ballots, any positives Carter achieved prior to the hostage crisis were forgotten. Excluding Carter's presidential errors, Reagan dominated the debates and ran a campaign filled with hope for a better America, to make America great again. Following Carter's tenure, through which he was observed to have plunged the United States into economic and political disrepair, Reagan appeared to the American people as a beacon of ambition and drive. At the end of the day, Carter didn't inspire hope or achievement in the release of the hostages, whereas Reagan did, demonstrating the effect of the crisis on the election.
In an interview in 2014, Carter has openly said that he felt he was not elected solely due to his inability to return the hostages. Clearly, this was a dominant issue which his administration had been incapable of answering, and it's clear that he did little to win back the faith in government which had already been lost in the 1970s. The US media really underlined the fact that the Iranian hostage crisis was Carter's failure, with reports coming out on the 20th of January 1981 with headlines such as Day 1 of Ronald Reagan's presidency and Day 1 of freedom for 52 Americans. Here it's clear that the connection between the removal of Carter and the freeing of the hostages is underlined explicitly.
Election is obviously a big deal to Americans. However, it did also create international interest. Carter seemed to be in a difficult situation, no matter what happened. If the hostages weren't released, he looks weak. However, as election date got closer, people began to think that if the hostages were released, he had been using them as a political tool. However, after the hostages are released, there are examples in English newspapers attributing the victory to Carter and blaming the Iranians for not allowing him this final victory. As well as this, Prime Minister Thatcher made sure to congratulate Carter for the victory.
In this series, we have examined the major events which led to and took place during the hostage crisis. These events undoubtedly constituted a difficult period in Jimmy Carter's term as president. How significant do you think the hostage crisis was as a reason for the failure of Carter's presidency? Tom?
From what has already been discussed, it's clear that the Iranian hostage crisis was the defining issue of his administration and was to some extent the author of his downfall. In addition, Operation Eagle Claw and its failure was a clear turning point in popular attitudes towards the president, as it was clear that his actions and his decisions had only prolonged the agony of the hostage crisis.
Building on Tom's point, the crisis ruined Carter's popularity, and thus the American people would not back him into a second term. The impact of the hostage crisis on Carter's presidency was that it was cut short, when he could have arguably had 4 more years in the Oval Office if not for the crisis.
The hostage crisis was a damaging event to Carter's reputation, especially due to the length of time that it dragged on for. However, the failed military operation does seem to have invoked the largest international response and been the most damaging part for Carter. This was due to America's reputation as a strong military power and the number of countries that relied on them for support and who would have been dragged into a war if full conflict had broken out.
As mentioned in the last episode, a precedent had been set in US-Iranian relations by the presidents preceding Carter. With the Shah, Carter was left with very little scope for manoeuvre and was virtually forced into a supportive role. His immediate rallying call after the hostage-taking was an inspiration to the US people and gained him much valuable support in the first weeks of the crisis. However, his decision to link himself directly with the fate of the hostages massively backfired, as he was unable to resolve the crisis. In summary, I believe the crisis gave Carter a major opportunity. If resolved well, he could have made himself the frontrunner for the 1980 election. As it was, the hostages proved a constant weight round his neck in campaigning, and the main reason for his downfall. In this series, we hope we have given a comprehensive overview of the events leading to and taking place during the hostage crisis, and the impact of these, particularly from an American perspective. When President Carter left office in January 1981, it was clear that the hostage crisis had played some part. We hope that we have managed to contribute something to the argument around how big a part. Thank you for joining us for our final episode of Carter's Crisis. I've been your host, Adam Tobin. Goodbye.